Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we have really an addendum episode to the series we just finished on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States from Revolution to Civil War. And it's really a capstone, you might say, or the rest of the story for this series. Today's episode is another case study based around one particular individual who lived and worked towards the end of the timeline we established in the main series and made his mark in the aftermath of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. We'll be using the 1885 book, Our America, and the life of Reverend Josiah Strong to illustrate the fallout of the Civil War for Catholics and the rise of a movement, the social gospel movement. Will really be focused at least on just this one strain of the social gospel movement that Josiah Strong was one of the founders of. I think this episode deserves a little context as to why this almost 150-year-old book and a character almost nobody knows about, Josiah Strong, deserves his very own episode and its very own episode. Now, my thesis is that the past can be illustrative of future events and certainly impact them, but events and movements of the past are not deterministic on the future. I think we showed that point very clearly in this whole series on the Catholic Church in America. We'll also see that idea very clearly with someone like Josiah Strong in the social gospel movement, especially with its relationship to the Catholic Church in the aftermath of the Civil War. The history and politics gets very messy very quickly. Before we jump into the full story, I'd like to share a little bit about the genesis of why I decided this somewhat strange and random source and use that to build an entire episode around. The context is a little interesting, at least to me, and ties back to a key theme of this series of encouraging people to investigate and honestly love the history of their location and area. All history is local. So back to the meta background of this episode. When I lived in Buffalo, New York, we would go to this brew pub that was incidentally Erie Canal history themed called Big Ditch. They aren't supporting this episode, but if you find yourself in downtown Buffalo and want a decent place to go, I highly recommend it. One Saturday, we decided to treat ourselves and the family and went down there. There was a bit of a wait, so we walked around, and right across the street was a really cool old bookshop called Old Editions. So we went into the store, and my wife saw this book mixed in called Our Country by Josiah Strong. For one, this edition was from 1895. The original was published in 1885, but the book was in excellent condition, and it had what I believe to be the original receipt from the store it was purchased at. I bet the first owner used that receipt from Beard and Allen Grocer in Watertown, New York as a bookmark. The book sat on my bookshelf for years, but when I started writing this series, I really wanted to use this book as one of my primary sources, but it ended up being after the time period I covered in the series. I am using it now as an addendum to the main series to show the trajectory of the themes we discussed in the 10-part main series. So first off, let's discuss Josiah Strong, who he was and what the social gospel movement that he was leading was. Josiah Strong was a Protestant minister, writer, and reformer who became one of the best-known voices of the social gospel movement in the late 19th century. As I alluded to in the introduction, he is best remembered for his book, Our Country, where he argued that Protestant Christianity had a major role to play in shaping the future of the United States. Strong cared deeply about social problems brought on by urbanization, immigration, poverty, and industrialization, but his ideas were also tied up with Anglo-Saxonism, nationalism, and a deeply anti-Catholic strain that shaped much of his thought. That combination made him an important figure for understanding both the reforming energy and some of the darker assumptions that ran through American Protestant culture to this day. The social gospel movement was a Protestant reform movement that took shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It argued that Christianity was not only about personal salvation, but also about addressing the social conditions created by poverty, inequality, urban growth, and industrialization. In that world, ministers and reformers like Josiah Strong believed the church had a duty to help shape society itself, for better and for worse. And that is really, when we refer to the church, we're really talking about the Protestant church, not the Catholic church whatsoever. The social gospel movement was a broad effort to apply Christianity to the problems of modern society, but it carried a real tension within it from the start. On one side, it pushed for helping the poor, strengthening society, and responding to the pressures of industrial life. But on the other hand, it often assumed that educated Protestant elites had the right and even the duty to shape the moral direction of the nation. That was tied up with an Anglo-Saxon element that treated certain cultural and religious assumptions as the natural foundation of American life. At the same time, the movement was pulled between socialist and capitalist trends, sometimes criticizing the harshness of a modern economic life, often stopping short of rejecting the broader social order that produced those conditions. All that being said, Josiah Strong fell strongly into the capitalist and anti-socialism sect, I guess you might say, of the social gospel movement. The real heart of the social gospel movement, and the best short summary of it, is that it grew out of the Second Great Awakening and the abolitionist fervor of the pre and slightly after Civil War era. A way you could put it is that the abolitionist movement ran out of steam after slavery had ended and the freed slaves had been given full rights. It was a total victory in a lot of ways and a mission accomplished moment for the abolitionist movement. These religious reformers didn't naturally shift at that time into a mode of helping the newly freed slaves. That could be seen as a critique of the movement. I think that the problems, or maybe the challenges faced by the United States in the post-Civil War era, all exploded in such a way that nobody could really expect and even react in a structured way. Reconstruction wasn't going the way that many wanted it to. The northern industrial cities were full of social ills, at least to many critics. The country was riddled with a certain type of substance abuse, not drugs in this case, but alcohol. A war would be launched against alcohol that would make the war on drugs look like a tame affair. Then, for some of the social gospel reformers like Josiah Strong, there was the peril of socialism. That's what he called his problems, perils. Other social gospel reformers would eventually embrace socialism, creating the idea of Christian socialism. Another major peril, and it's interesting that he uses the word peril, but then had a lot of problems with Pope Pius IX's syllabus of errors, but we'll get into some of his thoughts on Roman Catholicism. But another major peril someone like Strong saw was immigration. Immigration came to the major urban areas, and urbanization was a major source of social ill, according to Strong. Finally, there was the public schools. Public compulsory education was supposed to be a way to make good citizens and therefore good Americans, citizens who understood and were dedicated to the idea of Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity and what he viewed as the natural corollary, the American dream and American virtues. So we see the nativism that we explored in the main series of the history of the Catholic Church in the United States from Revolution to Civil War grew and evolved after the Civil War. The old stock, quote unquote, Native Americans felt they had something special and they had to spread that something special. As we progress through this episode, we will dive into some of the issues we laid out above and use a shocking and little known incident to dig further into this time period. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/history of the papacy and join today.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
The first place we'll start is immigration. Everything concerning Catholics in the United States flows from immigration. For Strong, immigration was not just a large-scale movement of people. It was a shift in the balance of the nation itself. He focused on the growing number of Southern and Eastern Europeans and saw that change and departure from what he believed had been the country's original foundations. He was especially concerned that many of these immigrants brought with them religious traditions, cultural habits, and political assumptions that he believed were incompatible with American institutions. In his mind, this was not simply difference, it was a real danger. He feared that concentrated immigrant communities in rapidly growing cities would create pockets of society that were difficult to assimilate and that could influence politics, labor, and political life in ways that would undermine what he saw as the nation's stability. Immigration then became more than just a single issue. It tied directly into his concern about the city, about poverty, about political corruption, and especially about religion. For Strong, the immigrant was not just a newcomer, just some guy who shows up wanting to get a little job, make a little cash, but a symbol of a broader transformation that he believed could either be guided and controlled or allowed to reshape the country in ways he found deeply troubling. One of the most troubling aspects of immigration was what he saw as the rootlessness of many newcomers. So this is like a double-edged sword here. He believed that the large number of immigrants arrived without deep ties to American institutions, traditions, or communities, and that this lack of rootedness made them more vulnerable to instability and disorder. In his view, people who were not anchored, as well as not anchored in the right kind of religious and cultural framework, could be easily drawn into poverty, crime, political manipulation. He connected this rootlessness directly to the conditions of the modern city, where dense immigrant populations, economic hardship, and rapid social change all came together. For Strong, the problem was not simply that immigrants were poor, but they lacked the kind of moral and social grounding he believed was necessary to sustain a healthy society. He saw emerging really big problems in the United States, and he wanted to deal with them. The question of immigration was closely tied to concerns about crime, especially in the rapidly growing cities of the country and of the East Coast. He had a real issue of the divide between the East Coast and then basically the area west of the Mississippi. He had a lot of issues, and we could spend hours on his many issues, and it's not even that big of a book, but we will see that his issues were multifaceted. So he believed that the large numbers of immigrants concentrated in urban areas and lacking what he saw as a proper moral and social foundation created conditions where crime could take root more easily. In his view, it was not just individual wrongdoing, but the environment itself, shaped by poverty, overcrowding, and cultural difference that contributed to rising disorder. He often treated immigrant communities as especially vulnerable to vice and criminal activities, and at times suggested that they could be destabilized and be a destabilizing force in public life. This connection between immigration and crime reinforced his broader fear that the nation's institutions, particularly in cities, could be weakened if these trends were not guided or controlled. Strong felt that these immigrants, who weren't tied to the ideals of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant, would form their own communities and voting blocs. Immigrants, particularly the Irish and the Germans, were far too loose with their alcohol consumption already and would only get worse if they were allowed to stay in their own ethnic enclaves. Strong also believed that new immigrants would be drawn to socialism as well. Now, just to be fair, in all of these perils, when you get down to it, Strong also felt that the old stock, what they would call back then Native Americans, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they could all easily fall into any of these traps as well if they became unmoored to a community and to a church. And this idea of the social gospel movement was really about not as much saving souls, because you hardly see Jesus or Christ or any of that mentioned in the church. It was, or in the book of our country. It was really focused on day-to-day problems, but we are going to continue to build on the perils that Strong saw in society. And one of the major perils of Strong we'll discuss is public schooling. In our country, the idea of public schooling, in the book at least, our country, the issue of public schooling brought many of his concerns into sharp focus, especially when it came to Catholic immigration and the growth of parochial schools. And he saw, to really get down to brass tacks, he saw that the public school system was one of the primary tools for shaping the nation's moral and civic character, a place where a shared identity, American identity, could be formed and reinforced. But really that whole thing was based on a Protestant framework, and that's what really worked. And then so he had a real problem with parochial Catholic schools, because they could be fighting for the same resources. And he was very concerned, Strong was very concerned that the Catholic catechism and the allegiance to the Pope would dominate amongst those children educated in the Catholic schools and be at odds with really Americanism. And to give the guy a little credit, Strong here, there's a quote that I always come back to, especially as a teacher, it's from the founder of the Jesuit order himself, Ignatius Loyola, who is said to have said, "Give me the child until he is 7, and I will give you the man." But sometimes this quote's more ominously repeated as, "Give me the child until he is 7, and he is mine for life." So you could take those quotes as in either a benevolent or a less than benevolent take, but really, when you get down to it, in short, that education is extremely important in foundation and really of what will a society become. And it's an issue like many of these issues that are still debated today in this very day. Now, one other issue was intemperance, and the question of alcohol was not just about personal morality. It was also tied into immigration, culture, and political power. Strong, interestingly, had infographics in his books. The infographic must have been in its infancy because they were really quite simplistic, but they tell great stories all the same, like any great infographic should. So one of these infographics is a large square with a tiny square in the corner. The large square represented the amount of money spent on liquor in the United States, and then the tiny square represented the amount of money donated to churches in the U.S. And Strong was really using what you might call strong tools to point out his message. Native or U.S.-born Anglo-Saxons had their share of drinking problems as well, and Strong makes us know that point very well. The bigger issue that combines with some of our other issues was the use of alcohol among immigrants. German immigrant communities in particular had well-developed cultural traditions around beer, which put them at odds with the growing temperance movement. For Germans, for crying out loud, drinking beer was not just cracking a cold one after a long day at work while watching the big game. Beer and all things beer was an essential part of their culture and even economic livelihood. The beer hall is where things got done. And as we learned in the main series, Germans were highly organized as Catholics. The struggle between these beer-loving Germans and temperance-leaning nativist Protestants really shows up clearly in politics, and I'd like to discuss just a quick mini case study, mini bio, and that's of the 22nd/24th president of the United States, Grover Cleveland. He drew early support for his political and presidential ambitions from German voters and was known to drink with them, I dare say frequently at that. This is something that nativists seized upon as a major problem, not only the drinking, but also the Germans. Cleveland's natural support base was with nativist Protestants, especially the leadership in Buffalo, New York. It might seem like a small detail became symbolic of something much bigger. And I promise again that I'm not being paid in any way by the Big Ditch Brewing Company in Buffalo, but they had a German Doppelbock named Big Steve after Grover Cleveland. His full name was Stephen Grover Cleveland. And as an aside, the beer was brewed in conjunction with Great Lakes Brewery, which I dearly miss since it's not widely distributed in Texas. But don't feel bad for me and my love of all things German, is especially where it goes for beer making. Texas has its own German beer tradition due to the large number of Germans that settled here in the mid-19th century. But that all aside, when it came to temperance and alcohol, for critics like Strong, these issues raised questions about loyalty, culture, and then the direction of the country. And it really spoke to some larger anxieties about immigration that were floating around the country. Now, Josiah laid out a number of perils that the late 19th century faced, but among all the economic and demographic perils, one theme that cut through many of these perils was the Roman Catholic Church, what Strong always called Romanism. And it was not just one peril among many for Strong. It was one of the main lenses through which he understood all the others, and that a lot of the perils all linked together because they were all involving Catholicism in some way. It was the allegiance to the Pope that was the big problem for Strong, an allegiance to a power outside of the United States. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center, may not be available in all states, not available in California.
Strong laid out some really interesting arguments on his chapter on Romanism. He clearly knew what he was talking about when it came to the structure of the church, but wasn't always completely fair about in his arguments. And whatever you want to say about him, Strong did not preach violence at all, and even quite to the opposite. And what he was participating in a wider atmosphere of suspicion where Catholics and immigrants were increasingly treated not simply as neighbors, but potential threats to the fabric of the country. Now, moving on, in 1885, Josiah Strong published Our Country, as we said, laying out what he believed were these perils. But just 6 years later, so in between the original publishing and then the second edition republishing, in 1891, in the city of New Orleans, those anxieties that Strong really embodied in these books would collide with reality in a way that still shocks us to this day, if you've heard of the event. When we think of lynchings in the American South, we often assume we know the story, the familiar, tragic, and just an all too common story. It was too common, but not every story fits the pattern we expect. In this case, the victims were not who many would assume, and the forces at work were not as simple as they first appear. What happened in New Orleans in 1891 forces us to look at these fears, these tensions, and the lines that were being drawn in American society at the very moment Strong was warning us and worrying that the nation stood at a crossroads. And this is where the story begins to break down. The victims in New Orleans on March 14th, 1891 were not Black African Americans, as many would expect when they hear the words lynching in the South. They were Italian immigrants. 11 men, swept up in fear, suspicion, and anger, became the targets of the largest mass lynching in American history. This was not some isolated outburst. It was a moment where many of the same tensions we have been talking about, immigration, religion, identity, and who truly belong, came together in a violent and public way. What follows is a case study of the 1891 New Orleans Italian lynching, and a moment that forces us to confront how deeply these fears ran and how quickly they would turn to action. Let's just talk a little tiny bit about Italian immigration in general and then zoom into the situation in New Orleans. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a infographic. I'm loving the infographics too, that kind of show what was going on with Italian immigration. There was an explosion of Italian immigration in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And there was a really distinct pattern as well. Northern Italians generally migrated to South America, and Southern Italians migrated to the United States and Canada. And this pattern is really fascinating because Northern Italians moved to places in South America where Spanish was the native language and the predominant culture. The Northern Italians integrated very smoothly into South American countries. Their culture and their language were so familiar, whereas Southern Italians entered into a North American culture that was extremely different to their own. As we can see from our country, these Southern Italians were not entering in what could be considered friendly territory. These people from the area of Southern Italy, like Calabria, Sicily, Basilicata, spoke a vastly different language than English, obviously, were Roman Catholics, and more often than not, weren't very educated and had deep-seated distrust of government and institutions. These immigrants from Southern Italy came to take low-paid, low-skilled jobs, which was and is a common immigration pattern in the U.S. history, but can be seen as a major conflict with native-born Americans who also want those jobs. So in the United States, when we think of Italian-American culture, we're really thinking primarily as the descendants of Southern Italians. New Orleans became one of the first major areas of Italian immigration. Italians quickly took over the docks and other industries. They brought some other organizations as well besides their Roman Catholic Church, such as an early version of organized crime. The mafia is an umbrella term used today, but each area of Southern Italy had its own homegrown version with a different name, but in American popular culture, they've all kind of been boiled down to being called the mafia, sometimes La Cosa Nostra. That was another name for the 'Ndrangheta is another one. They're all still around today in Southern Italy and operating in the United States. But interestingly enough, the Northern Italians didn't have these organizations like the mafia. So when the mafia spread, it was Southern Italians. Even in Northern Italy to this very day, the Southern mafia operations have operations in Northern Italy. They're not homegrown. But so these Italian immigrants were isolated from the rest of society, and their differences in views from the native Anglo-Saxons and even previous generations of immigrants, even Catholic immigrants, really separated them. And that really leads us to the road to 1891's lynching. And it did begin with the murder of New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy in October of 1890, so a few months earlier. As he lay there dying, word spread that he had blamed, and I'm going to use a derogatory term, but it's a direct quote, Dagos, and suspicion very quickly fell onto the city's Italian immigrant community. What they were saying, what the people were saying is that on his deathbed, Hennessy, as he was dying in the street, Hennessy had blamed derogatory name here for Italian Americans, and the people ran with it. What followed was not a narrow investigation, but a broad crackdown with large number of Italian men being arrested and being held in prison and with public pressure mounting. Now, that being said, Hennessy was shot with a sawed-off shotgun, and the mafiosi of Sicily were famous in their use of a version of a chopped-down shotgun called a lupara. I don't know if all this gun talk will get this somehow banned on YouTube, but it's pretty, I think, historical anyways. Also, and just to show the complications of this time, Hennessy himself was a child of Irish immigrants. But so this all became a flashpoint, not just about solving a murder or maybe investigation of organized crime, but about crime, immigration, and whether this community could be trusted at all. When the trials finally took place in March of 1891, the prosecutor's cases proved weak, relying on a lot of bad evidence, questionable testimony, and the jury actually acquitted several of the defendants, while other cases ended in mistrials. And this is talking about in 1891, not all these newfangled lawyers with all their tricks. This is probably a hanging jury, if you will. And believe it or not, that outcome did not calm the situation. It ignited it further. As this public outrage surged, a mass meeting was called to address what many saw as the failure of justice. And on March 14th, the crowd gathered, moved on to the parish prison. Parish meaning in Louisiana, they call their counties parishes. If you're from outside of Louisiana, I don't know. I'd never heard of that until very recently. But anyways, parish is just a local prison, and carried out one of the largest lynchings in American history, especially at one time. 11 Italian men were killed, some shot, some hanged. And a violence just carried out right in the open with the approval of the crowd. What began as a murder investigation had transformed into a collective act of retribution against this entire immigrant community. But incidentally enough, the authorities would eventually feel bad about it, I guess you might say. And they did give reparations to the murder victims a long time later, going back maybe into around 2019. The mayor of New Orleans, he offered an official apology. So there is that. And you've got to say something that they did do something about this. So to wrap up this episode and this little postscript to the series on the history of the Catholic Church in the United States from Revolution to Civil War, I want to firstly say explicitly, I don't think that the Reverend Josiah Strong is the villain of this story, or a villain in any way. He was dealing in the marketplace of ideas. He wrote books, gave lectures, preached. I never read anything in his book as a call to violence. For the most part, his logic was internally consistent. One could very easily disagree with his perspectives, and I certainly did at many points. That being said, Josiah Strong operated during a time where America was entering a new phase of its existence as a nation. This new phase had many growing pains. But this era between Reconstruction and World War I was where the America we know today was born. This was not just a story about Josiah Strong. It's a story about how people tried to make sense of a changing world and what happened when fear and uncertainty collided. So with that, I will see you on our next trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolfe. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.